Aretha Franklin was more than a singer. She was the voice of an entire generation, the embodiment of gospel power transformed into mainstream dominance, the woman who could silence a room with a single note and send chills through the spine of the most hardened soul. Whitney Houston, decades later, would come to embody that same essence, a divine voice that seemed to transcend human boundaries. But beneath the beauty of their music lay a story few dared to unravel, one that spoke of admiration, rivalry, protection, betrayal, and ultimately heartbreaking truth. Aretha's final words about Whitney were not the ones people expected, and when the world heard them, it changed everything we thought we knew about these two icons. To understand the weight of Aretha Franklin's final words, you first need to understand the bond and tension between these two queens of soul and pop. Aretha was born into music royalty. As the daughter of the great Reverend C.L. Franklin, her gospel roots were undeniable. She began singing in church as a child, and by the time she reached her teens, her voice was already a force of nature. She came from a tradition of pain, strength, and spirituality, and when she crossed into the mainstream, she carried with her the echoes of the Black church and the struggles of her people. By the 1960s, Aretha was not just a singer, she was the Queen of Soul, a title she earned with blood, sweat, and years on the road, belting songs that demanded respect. She was the standard. She was the one others were compared to, and she knew it. Then came Whitney. Born in 1963, Whitney Elizabeth Houston was the daughter of gospel singer Cissy Houston and the cousin of Dionne Warwick. Her voice was groomed in the same traditions as Aretha's, the church being her foundation. But Whitney's arrival was different. She entered an industry that was ready for crossover appeal, and she was marketed not only as a soul singer, but also as America's sweetheart. She had the gospel foundation, yes, but she also had the image, the beauty, the poise, the smile that lit up screens. And when Clive Davis pushed her into superstardom in the 1980s, Whitney became a global phenomenon almost overnight. Her records shattered sales figures, her ballads ruled radio, and she carried with her a voice so perfect it almost seemed supernatural. She became known as The Voice, and that title was one Aretha Franklin did not always appreciate. Then in 1985, everything changed when Whitney's debut album soared to the top of the charts. For the first time, a young singer was being hailed with titles that had once been reserved for Aretha. Critics called Whitney the new queen. She was dubbed the next Aretha Franklin, the natural heir. But Aretha wasn't gone yet. She was still recording, still performing, still holding onto her throne. And she did not take kindly to the media trying to replace her with someone she saw as still a newcomer. From that moment, the tension began, a mixture of respect, pride, and competition. Aretha admired Whitney's gift, yes, but she was also fiercely protective of her own legacy. This wasn't just about music. It was about identity, about legacy, about the crown. By the early 1990s, the rivalry became obvious. Whenever there was a list of greatest singers, Whitney's name began creeping closer to Aretha's. Whenever Whitney delivered one of her iconic performances, whether it was the Star-Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl or her legendary run in The Bodyguard, people began whispering that perhaps she was the greatest of all time. And Aretha noticed. She noticed when Whitney was crowned with accolades that had once belonged to her. She noticed when critics compared them directly. And she noticed when Whitney was being treated not just as her equal, but, in some circles, her superior. That sting never quite went away. Then in 1994, at the American Music Awards, something unforgettable happened. Aretha and Whitney were scheduled to perform together, a dream pairing for fans. But behind the scenes, the tension was electric. Aretha was determined not to be overshadowed. She reportedly made last-minute changes, altering keys and arrangements, making sure her voice stood firm against Whitney's flawless delivery. What came out on stage was nothing short of extraordinary, a battle disguised as a duet. The audience erupted, but insiders knew it wasn't just a performance. It was a clash of queens, a fight for dominance disguised in soaring notes and gospel runs. That night, the rivalry was no longer subtle. It was front and center, and everyone felt it. But beneath the competition, there was also connection. Aretha understood Whitney's struggles, even if she never fully said it out loud in those years. Whitney's career was dazzling, but it was also suffocating. The pressure to be perfect, the endless demands, the attempt to balance her personal life with her public image, it weighed on her. And as the years went on, Whitney began to crack. The tabloids feasted on her troubled marriage to Bobby Brown. The whispers of drug abuse turned into headlines. The once untouchable superstar began to spiral, and through it all, Aretha was watching. She didn't always step in publicly, but she was watching. She knew better than anyone what it meant to carry that much weight, to live under that much scrutiny, to have your private life dissected and judged. And as Whitney's life unraveled, Aretha's feelings shifted from rivalry to something else: sorrow. Then in 2012, the unthinkable happened. Whitney Houston was gone at just 48 years old. The news shocked the world, but for Aretha, it cut deeper than most people realized. The young woman who had once been positioned as her rival, the singer who had been called her replacement, was gone. And with her went a piece of history, a voice that would never be matched again. When Aretha was asked to speak on Whitney's passing, people expected her to offer polite condolences, maybe a brief statement of grief. But what Aretha said stunned everyone. She didn't hold back. She spoke of Whitney not as a competitor, but as a fragile soul who had been devoured by fame, a victim of forces too powerful to fight. She said, "Whitney was one of the greatest voices the world has ever known, but more than that, she was a young woman with a heart too tender for this business." Those words shocked people because they weren't about music, they were about humanity. Aretha went further. She revealed things few had expected. She hinted that Whitney had been mistreated by the industry, that she had been pushed too far, too fast, without the protection she truly needed. She acknowledged Whitney's demons but refused to judge her for them. Instead, she placed the blame on the machinery of fame, on the people who profited from her downfall, on the vultures who circled her until she collapsed. For once, Aretha wasn't defending her crown. She was defending Whitney's memory. And in that moment, the rivalry seemed to dissolve, replaced by a raw truth that only Aretha could deliver. In the days following Whitney Houston's death, Aretha Franklin's comments made headlines around the world. But while the public heard her official statements, behind the scenes her words were even more revealing. She told those closest to her that Whitney's tragedy was a cautionary tale, one that mirrored the dangers Aretha herself had narrowly escaped in her own youth. Aretha had endured abusive relationships, record label exploitation, and crushing expectations. She had survived because she was guarded, fiercely private, and unwilling to let people dictate her every move. Whitney, however, had been far more vulnerable. She wanted to please everyone, to be perfect for the cameras, and that, Aretha said, was what ultimately destroyed her. These weren't just casual observations. They were confessions, admissions from one legend who had managed to survive to another who could not. Then in 2015, 3 years after Whitney's passing, Aretha gave an interview that reignited conversations. She was asked about Whitney, and her response shocked even seasoned journalists. She said, "Whitney didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was strong, but she was surrounded by people who didn't value her strength. They used her, and when she had nothing left to give, they let her fall." Those words cut like a knife. They weren't the polished, cautious statements of an industry veteran protecting her peers. They were direct, unapologetic, and filled with a sense of final reckoning. Aretha wasn't just mourning Whitney, she was exposing the truth about an industry that had devoured countless artists before and after. By this point, Aretha herself was aging, and she knew her own time was limited. That awareness gave her words more weight. She no longer had to protect record executives, managers, or publicists. She could speak with the freedom of someone who had already given the world everything she had. And so, she spoke of Whitney in ways that no one else dared. She acknowledged the rumors, the addiction, the troubled marriage, but she framed it differently. She said Whitney wasn't broken, she was betrayed. She said the world saw the drugs and the chaos, but few saw the loneliness, the fear, the isolation of being turned into a commodity instead of being treated as a human being. For Aretha, Whitney's story was not just tragedy, it was prophecy. A warning for every young artist who thought fame was a blessing when, in reality, it could be a curse. Then in 2017, during an appearance at a gospel tribute, Aretha addressed Whitney's legacy again, this time in front of a church audience. She spoke about Whitney's gospel roots, about how her first love was the church choir, and how those roots had been overshadowed by the glitz of Hollywood. She said, Whitney's real voice wasn't for the charts. It was for God. That's where she found her joy, and that's where she lost it, when they pulled her too far away from it. The congregation erupted with amens, but outside the church, the press focused on one thing: Aretha's implication that Whitney had been stripped of her true identity by fame itself. It was a bold statement, but one that rang true. And it came from someone who had walked that very same tightrope between gospel authenticity and mainstream stardom. By the time 2018 arrived, Aretha Franklin was gravely ill. She had been battling pancreatic cancer, and though she tried to keep her condition private, the news inevitably spread. In those final months, she spoke often about the people who mattered to her, the legacy she wanted to leave, and the lessons she hoped the next generation would learn. And once again, Whitney Houston came up. Aretha told close friends and family that Whitney's death haunted her, that she saw it as a constant reminder of what the industry could do to even the strongest voices. She said, "They called her the voice, but they didn't protect that voice. They didn't protect the woman behind it, and now she's gone and we're all poorer for it." These were not casual remarks. They were Aretha's way of making sure the world understood that Whitney's life was more than tabloid scandals, more than addiction headlines. It was about talent, vulnerability, and the price of fame. Then came August 2018. As Aretha's health deteriorated, she received visitors, phone calls, and messages from those who had loved her and those who had admired her. In those quiet final days, she shared words that would later be repeated by those closest to her. When asked what she thought about Whitney now, years after her passing, Aretha said something that stunned those present. She said, "Whitney was my little sister, even when we didn't see eye to eye. I didn't always show it, but I loved her." And I'll say this, if Whitney had been born in another time, without all those pressures, she'd still be here. Her gift was too great, and this world didn't know how to handle it. That statement, those final words about Whitney, revealed more than decades of rivalry ever could. They showed love, regret, and a recognition that their bond was deeper than competition. Aretha admitted in her last days that what united them was far greater than what divided them. When news of Aretha's passing spread on August 16, 2018, tributes poured in from across the globe. Presidents, musicians, and fans all mourned the loss of the Queen of Soul, but tucked within those tributes were reminders of her words about Whitney. Journalists and fans alike revisited those interviews, those statements, those candid remarks. And for many, it was the first time they truly understood the depth of Aretha's feelings. She hadn't seen Whitney as just a rival. She had seen her as family, as a younger version of herself, as a warning of what could have happened to her too. And her final words about Whitney weren't just shocking, they were liberating. They freed Whitney's memory from the scandal-ridden headlines and reframed her as a woman who had been both divine and tragically human. What makes those words even more powerful is what they say about Aretha herself. For decades, she was painted as fiercely competitive, as protective of her throne, as unwilling to let anyone else share her crown. And in many ways, that was true. But her final reflections on Whitney revealed another side, a side of empathy, vulnerability, and even guilt. She admitted indirectly that she could have done more, that perhaps she could have reached out when Whitney was struggling. And that unspoken regret hung heavy in those words. It was as if, in her last days, Aretha was trying to make peace not only with Whitney's memory, but also with her own. Even now, years after both women have left this world, those final words linger. They remind us that greatness often comes with a price, that the brightest voices are often the most fragile, and that behind every headline is a human story of pain and resilience. Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston were more than rivals. They were bookends of an era, two queens who defined what it meant to sing with soul. And when Aretha spoke of Whitney in her final days, she gave the world permission to remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived, for the music, the spirit, the gift that will never be duplicated. Long after Aretha Franklin's passing, the echoes of her final words about Whitney Houston have continued to ripple through music history. Fans, critics, and even fellow musicians have dissected them, realizing that what she said wasn't just about Whitney, it was about every artist who had been crushed under the weight of expectation. Aretha had lived long enough to see generations of stars rise and fall, but Whitney's fall haunted her the most. And that haunting became her last warning to the industry she herself had conquered. She wanted people to understand that talent alone wasn't enough to survive. You could have the greatest voice in the world, but without protection, without love, without boundaries, you could still be destroyed. And Whitney Houston became the ultimate proof of that truth. Looking back, it's almost eerie to see how often Aretha foreshadowed Whitney's fate. In the 1990s, when Whitney's troubles first began to surface, Aretha was one of the few to say that fame had a dark side no one was willing to acknowledge. She knew the machine. She knew how executives could smile in your face while counting the dollars behind your back. She knew how entourages could drain a star's energy while pretending to be supportive. And she knew how the public could elevate someone to near sainthood one day and then devour them the next when they stumbled. Aretha had survived it because she built a fortress around herself, one made of privacy, control, and fierce independence. Whitney, on the other hand, opened herself to the world, and the world swallowed her whole. Aretha's words made it clear, this was not weakness. It was simply the cost of being too open, too trusting, too human. Then in 2020, 2 years after Aretha's death, a previously unreleased interview surfaced where she again spoke of Whitney. The conversation had taken place quietly, away from the cameras, during her declining health. In it, Aretha said something that struck everyone who heard it. "When I look at Whitney, I see what could have happened to me. If I hadn't put up walls, if I hadn't kept my circle small, I could have been right where she was. That's why it hurts so much. I see myself in her." Those words revealed the heart of the matter. Aretha wasn't just mourning Whitney. She was confessing that the difference between survival and tragedy had been razor thin. The world had gotten one queen who lived long enough to tell her story, and one queen who did not. But perhaps the most shocking element of Aretha's final words wasn't the empathy. It was the way she redirected the blame. She refused to let Whitney be remembered solely as a cautionary tale about drugs or bad choices. She pointed the finger at the system, the record labels, the handlers, the media, and the fans who demanded perfection at all costs. She said Whitney was not broken but broken down, not a weak addict but a strong woman under siege. This was a radical reframing of a story that tabloids had twisted for years. And coming from Aretha Franklin, the queen of soul herself, those words carried a power that no gossip column ever could. Even Whitney's family members took note. Sissy Houston, Whitney's mother, publicly thanked Aretha for speaking truth about her daughter's struggles. Dionne Warwick, Whitney's cousin, echoed similar sentiments, saying that Aretha's words helped shift the narrative away from scandal and back toward legacy. For years, Whitney had been defined by her downfall, but with Aretha's last words, she was redefined by her humanity. She became not just a superstar who fell, but a woman who had given too much of herself to a world that didn't know how to cherish it. And in many ways, that redefinition was Aretha's gift to Whitney, one final act of sisterhood after a lifetime of competition. Today, when people talk about Aretha Franklin's legacy, they mention the voice, the activism, the endless list of hits. But increasingly, they also mention her truth-telling. They mention the way she spoke candidly about her peers, unafraid to stir controversy if it meant defending the dignity of an artist. And Whitney Houston became one of the most significant examples of that. Aretha's final reflections became a lens through which millions re-examined Whitney's career, asking new questions about the industry, about fame, and about what it means to survive as an artist. In a way, Aretha's last words extended Whitney's legacy. They made sure that she wasn't remembered only as a tabloid tragedy, but as one of the most important, most gifted voices in history, an artist who deserved more protection than she ever got. And so, when you think of Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston, you can't just think of them as rivals. Yes, there was competition. Yes, there were clashes of ego and pride. But beyond all that, there was a deeper story, one of lineage, of inheritance, of shared struggle. Aretha was the queen of soul. Whitney was the voice. Both titles were earned. Both women shaped music forever. But in the end, what mattered most wasn't who sang the higher note, who sold the most records, or who held the crown. What mattered was the humanity beneath it all. And Aretha's final words about Whitney stripped away the glitz and revealed that humanity in the rawest form. Even now, fans still wonder, what if Whitney had been given more time? What if she had been shielded from the pressures that ate her alive? What if she had found the same walls of protection Aretha had built for herself? Those questions will never be answered. But Aretha's words offer a kind of closure. They remind us that Whitney's life was not wasted, that her gift, though brief, was eternal. And that even in death she had someone, her fiercest rival, her elder sister in spirit, speaking truth on her behalf. That is a legacy no scandal can erase. So when we look back at Aretha Franklin's final reflections, we see something larger than just two careers. We see the story of music itself, the rise, the glory, the cracks, the fall, and the truth that remains. Whitney Houston shocked the world when she sang. Aretha Franklin shocked the world when she spoke. And together, even in death, they continue to remind us that behind every legend is a human being, fragile, brilliant, and unforgettable. And maybe that's the real shock of Aretha's final words. Not that she exposed Whitney, but that she exposed the industry, the cost of greatness, and the simple truth that even queens can break.